Okay, so welcome. This is our January meeting of the Sustainable Book Club Book Group here in northern Cape May County. I'm Ralph Cooper. I'm part of the Sustainable Jersey program here in Atlantic and Cape May County and Upper Township. We have the book that we chose for this meeting was Rescuing the Planet, is Rescuing the Planet by Tony Heiss. And Tony called me back during the holidays and had noticed we were having this book and volunteered to come tonight. And so we're happy to have him here to talk with us. We have about 14 people that signed up for the call. We've got quite a few on the call now, and we will hopefully get others to join as we go along. So what I'm going to do is turn this over to Tony, and he can share his screen and give us a presentation. Then we'll break for a question and answer period. The whole program should last about an hour or so. Okay, Tony.
Okay, Ralph, thank you so much. And thank you for choosing my book for the club. I'm absolutely delighted. I've put together a few pictures to show you that just talks about some of the themes in the book. So it may get us started. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay. This is a book about what's sometimes called the other environmental crisis, meaning not climate change, the biodiversity crisis. If we don't take action soon, something like 1 million species of plants and animals are at risk of extinction in the next few decades. Some of the times we hear about this was, for instance, Sudan, the last male white rhinoceros who died a few years back when he got an infection and his legs gave out, and here his beloved keeper came in for a final farewell. Other celebrity disappearances include Lonesome George, who was the last Pinta Island giant tortoise in the Galapagos Islands, thought to have been 100 or 101 years old at the time he left us a few years back. And unfortunately, these disappearances have led to a new word in the vocabulary, an endling. An endling is the last of its species. So Lonesome George was an endling, and we want to end the endlings. Keep that from happening. One of the reasons we got into trouble, this was one of the most popular pictures in America in the 1870s. It showed American progress, the then idea of what progress was. You see progress, this beautiful golden-haired young lady with not too many clothes on, floating over the landscape as she moves from the East Coast towards the West, trailing behind her telegraph wires, and in her wake are trains and stagecoaches and farmers. And in the darkness of the West that she's dispelling are the buffalo running away from her, the Native Americans in retreat, and the wildlife in retreat. In those days, we thought that doing something new and different meant doing something completely different. There was no room for what had been there. And that image stayed in our minds for quite a long time. More than a century ago, some people began thinking in a different way. One of the heroes of mine is a man named Benton MacKaye, who's best remembered as the father of the Appalachian Trail. We just celebrated the centennial of the Appalachian Trail last year. But even before that, back in 1900, the year he graduated from college, Benton Mackay and a pal bushwhacked their way up Stratton Mountain in the Green Mountains. There were no trails back in those days. Shinnied up the tallest tree they could find on the peak, and swaying there, Mackay said he suddenly had a vision that somehow he could look south all the way down the length of the Appalachians to Georgia, on the other direction look up to Maine, and that it all constituted the same place. And that someday perhaps there was some way of bringing that unity into being in a way that would make sense to people and that people could make use of. And he was always interested not just in the trail, but in the land around the trail, what he called the realm. And it took 100 years really to get the trail completely built and protected. And now the Appalachian Trail Conservancy has set as its goal for the next 100 years to begin to protect the realm. The end papers of my book have this wonderful map of some of the largest landscapes in North America. Mackay's realm is actually one of the smallest of them. You'll see it on the right there, running from top to bottom. Across the top is the amazing Canadian boreal forest, probably the largest intact wilderness left in the world. Extraordinary how long it stretches from Alaska all the way to Newfoundland. It's about 1,000 miles thick. Then the Appalachians are paralleled to the west by the Rocky Mountain chain. And in the 1990s, a Canadian lawyer and conservation activist named Harvey Locke had the equivalent of Mackay's insight when he was camping up in the woods in Canada and had the sense that there was a single landscape that connected Yellowstone Park to the south of him and the top of the Yukon all the way up to the north of him. And he said, let's see if we can try to work on protecting this Yellowstone to Yukon or Y to Y landscape. And since then, all kinds of people have been drawn to this vision, and it's been coming into being. And as we speak, it continues to be. Then across the southeast, the most recently recognized of all the world's biodiversity hotspots is the North American coastal plain. And of course, we're speaking tonight from within the coastal plain. It's hard to see on the map, but Cape May is there, as it has to be. Well, it's a good thing we started thinking at bigger scales, because our original idea of protecting landscapes was already getting to be too constricted. Even by 1988, there was a front page piece in the Science Times section of the New York Times about how animals were outgrowing the national parks that we'd set up. They would leave, and then if development had begun to encroach upon the boundaries of the park, they couldn't get back in. So we had to start stretching ourselves to think in a different way if we were going to retain the amazing biodiversity that the world had provided for us. Now, Edward O. Wilson, who just died, unfortunately, at the age of 92, was one of the leading lights in promoting the idea of protecting as much as possible. And in conversation with him one day, I came up with the phrase half Earth, which he then made the title of one of his many books, one of his many extraordinary books. And he'd also done some work on island biogeography back in the 1960s and could actually predict how much land needed to be saved. On the one hand, there were field studies showing that, by and large, most animals need to retain something like 50% of their original habitat if they have a chance of thriving. It varies. Sometimes it's as little as 25%. For other species, it's as much as 75%, but Wilson was able also to do some predictive biological math, saying that if we protect only 15% of the world, which is sort of where we're at the moment, sooner or later we'll wind up with only about a quarter of all the species that were here. Whereas if we bump that up to 50%, we can hope to save 80 to 90%. That's not everything, but it's much closer to everything than 25% is. So there's a certain bittersweetness built into the whole enterprise. And yet, what made the book such fun to write was traveling all around North America and seeing how many people were doing so many extraordinary things. That gives me hope for the fact that we can actually get ahead of this particular problem and prevent the mass extinctions that seem to be looming. That's worth reiterating. If we protect something like half the land, and of course, some places that means protecting more and other places less, but an aggregate of something like 50%, we can save up to 85, 90% of the other species with which we share this amazing planet. I'd like you for a moment to look into the soulful gaze of a Russian biologist named Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. In 1926, he wrote the sort of first biography of the biosphere and pointed out that container of all life, pointed out that it's quite ancient, as we know now. It's something like, 4 billion years old or older. It's huge when you look around the world from side to side, but it has this third dimension, or rather this almost absence of third dimension. From top to bottom, the biosphere is astonishingly thin, only a few miles thick. We sort of disguise that from ourselves by talking about vertical distances in feet. We say, oh, Mount Everest, it's 29,000 some feet high. That sounds so high. If we said it's 5 miles high, it wouldn't sound very high. Most species, not all, but most species that we know of live in a vertical belt that extends at the bottom from the depths of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean up to the top of Everest. And that's about, 12 and a half to 20 miles, 12 and a half miles. As one biologist said, if it was on level ground and a decent road, you could drive it in 20 minutes. So there's this built-in vulnerability to the allness of this place that we tend to ignore. And I think that makes it harder for us to sometimes to come to grips with just how much is at stake. So if we're going to protect something like half of the Earth, there seem to be 3 R's to go along with half Earth math. To retain the large landscapes that are still intact, to restore many of those that are no longer intact, but and are somewhat degraded, but have not lost all of what they once had, and then to reconnect bits, because we know now that animals tend to move around at much larger distances than we had thought before. So that's sort of what we're being asked to do. And for the first time, the United States has actually set its own goal in numerical terms. The Biden administration has adopted the slogan 30 by 30, meaning they hope to help protect something like 30% of the American land by the year 2030. If we're at 15% now, that's the challenge is talking about doubling the amount of land that would get protected. And if we're talking about 2030, that's only 8 years from now. Here's that boreal landscape that I was mentioning across the top of Canada. I had a chance to go up there, and it's amazingly how intact it is. It's the kind of frontier we thought had disappeared, those of us down here. you can fly for literally hours and hours and hours and see nothing but trees and trees and trees, and sometimes a river. And fortunately, the people who are going to help us pull through this crisis, unlike in the States, although they certainly didn't behave well to them, the settlers in Canada never actually dislodged the indigenous people, the First Nations. They're still in place. And now a whole new system of national parks is coming into being up there called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, IPAs or IPCAs. And the whole idea is that the people who've lived there for 10,000 years can be the rangers of these parks, the mucklucks on the ground, as they like to say. And that's going to protect huge tracts of the boreal forest in the next 10 years. There's a similar program in Australia where large amounts of land are being turned back to management by the Aboriginal population. And now the people who've helped those two continents come together are also looking around for other countries where the same kind of program could be instituted, which would make a great deal of sense because something like 50 to 80% of the still huge, wild, intact landscapes around the world have these native inhabitants, the people who know the land best and could be enlisted to save the bacon of all the rest of us and save the planet for us and for them and for the other species. Back in the 1970s, there was a move to reestablish something. America's delight in remembering that we invented the national park, but we also invented a second kind of national park, something called the Green Line Park, in which land gets protected, but is not necessarily all put into public ownership. The British adopted this idea for their national park system when they got around to making one after World War II. They decided they had to make the land something that was fit for the heroes who had fought in the war to come home to. So all the British national parks are the Green Line parks. They're designated as special places, but they remain almost entirely in private ownership. Just the idea is that care must be taken as they get changed, not to spoil what's there. They actually even have a two-tier system. They have the parks, and then on the one hand, on the other hand, they have slightly less protected areas called areas of outstanding natural beauty. A cumbersome term, as even they would admit. Well, in the as I said, we invented the Green Line Park as well. The Adirondack Park up at the north of New York State is the first Green Line Park in the world. And it's that 6 million acres is about half in public ownership. So the Carter administration, way back in the 1970s, thought it's time to dust this idea off and bring it back into prominence. And look at all these areas that we could begin to think of as special places that would almost double the size of the national park system. Well, the hitch was that they were going to introduce this as the great environmental initiative of the second Jimmy Carter administration. And then there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration because he got lumped by Ronald Reagan in 1980. And the idea went back on the shelf, including this map, which someone unearthed for me, showing all the treasured areas that, and I think of it as a treasure map, that could become potential Green Line parks. One of them is actually coming into being now. With my encouragement, the Delmarva Peninsula to the south of Cape May, they've protected something like 30% of that landscape already. Amazing farmlands and woodlands and tidal creeks. And They've now set themselves the goal of protecting at least half of that landscape by 2030. And they're calling it Delmarva Oasis, which is oasis being somehow derived from areas of outstanding natural beauty, but sounding a little outstanding areas, OA, oasis, sounding a little less cumbersome than AONB. Which brings us to Cape May, because of course, you are an astonishing place. On the one hand, you're down at the southern end of the huge contiguous Pine Barrens landscape that John McPhee did so much to help protect in the 1970s, and which did become the first or the second big Green Line park in the US. They got that far when they made the Pinelands National Reserve. And then of course you have the astonishing bird life that concentrates and flows through here on its way north in the spring and on its way south in the fall. And you also are facing the incredible future that seems to be projected for us of sea level rise, swamping most of the wetlands and beaches to the east of the Garden State Parkway and Route 9. And what one, as you probably know better than I do, one estimate in 2019 was that something like 45,000 houses would get flooded. But I also think you're very much on the front lines of something that we haven't yet quite come to terms with, which I started thinking of the other night as Half Earth 2.0. It's one thing to set ourselves the goal of protecting astonishing places, but we so far are going about it in a very piecemeal way that doesn't have much to do with the people who live there. I mean, the map on the left shows that we've got two visions of the Pinelands, for instance. There's the state designated area in dark green, and then there's the federally designated area in the green stripes. And you guys are sort of at the overlap. And then the map on the right shows all kinds of environmental initiatives in and around your area. Some by private groups, some by state groups, some by different kinds of state groups. You've got state forests, you've got wildlife management areas, you've got bits of the Fish and Wildlife Service preserves. You've got the saltwater wetlands managed by yet another group. It's a mishmash, and as Ralph and I were discussing on the phone the other day, it doesn't really, not only doesn't really consult the people who are here, the people who are not only most impacted by it, but who love the land the best, but it also is not fully funded. They keep, the state agencies, the federal agencies keep losing positions. The trails aren't what they ought to be. There's a lot that we have to get better at if we're going to make Half Earth a reality. And as I said, you guys are on the front line and will be needed. Your input will be desperately needed. One of the terms I ran across in writing the book, sort of the antithesis of the endling, was the spark bird, a term that birders use to refer to that moment and that species that at some point in their life called out to them, made itself known to them, and then thereafter they couldn't tear their eyes away for the rest of their lives, and made them into lifelong bird watchers. But that kind of moment where we reach out and find something in the natural world around us doesn't have to be a bird, of course. It could be a spectacular landscape like the Pinelands. It could be seeing all kinds of sights. It could be just what the sunrise looks like. There's something there that wants to call out to us and that we want to respond to. I'm so pleased to be able to join you tonight, and hope you'll enjoy my book. And if anyone wants to buy a copy and hasn't yet, I can offer you the COVID version of a book signing, which is if you send your address to Ralph and he passes it along to me, I will at least inscribe a bookplate for you, inscribed to your name, which you can then paste in the book. So now I'm done screen sharing and we can have a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate that. We have, I think the amount of people we have on the call tonight, instead of trying to use chat or whatever, we can just sort of raise our hand and people can speak up with any questions they might have. I just have one. I'll start with, Tony, in your book, you talked about the World Network of Biosphere Reserves that I think is sponsored or overseen by UNESCO.
Yes.
Is there any reserve like that that's in the United States or that's contemplated in the US?
There actually are a few biosphere reserves within the US, but the program ran into political trouble because even though the biosphere reserve concept is itself a Green Line Park concept, it's just a way of calling attention to some place special. It doesn't put it into government or any kind of public ownership. But people got suspicious because it was the UN agency that was behind it. It was one of these global schemes that was coming in to wrest our land away from us. So they've walked a rather careful line in terms of it. The other thing that makes the biosphere approach unique, biosphere reserve approach unique, is that it incorporates this idea of a core area where you really don't want to do much of anything, and a buffer zone where it'll be where more human uses are encouraged, but where the wildlife itself can wander in and out. So this idea of landscapes that have different intensities of use is built into the concept of the biosphere reserve. And I think that's a big advance and something that we haven't adopted in terms of, we're not really yet trying to buffer our national parks in the same way, even though some of the large landscape thinking that's going on these days talks about we need to find ways of connecting landscapes so that animals that really roam enormous distances can continue to have the kind of life they need.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? You have to unmute, Carrie. You have to unmute.
I went back and looked at the title of the book after I finished reading it because I had kept waiting and waiting for the part of the book to start about the ocean.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the next book, I guess.
But, you know, the vast majority of the earth is covered by water, and there's a tremendous amount of species there and useful products for us and whatnot. And I wonder if there's any kind of a half world or half life thing happening in the oceans.
Oh, yes, very much so. And it's going to need at least comparable kind of protection to keep all the fish, not only to keep the fish ecosystems alive, but to keep the fish ecosystems thriving to the extent that they can continue to provide us with fish to eat.
Right.
And they're beginning to make the same kind of long distance connections we were just talking about on land. I agree with you. Someone said the other day, if you look at this world that's 70% ocean, how come the planet isn't just called ocean rather than Earth? So I was just reading about a move by, I think it was Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica,
And Peru.
not only to designate large areas of their ocean territory as reserves, but to connect them up into a continuous arc of reserve. Because as we're beginning to discover, some of the fish are as wide-ranging as some of the land mammals. And they need to migrate and be able to have spawning areas and other parts of their life cycle protected as a whole. So yes, you've hit on my weak point. Thank you.
No, it's just that that's my particular interest, but it seems very daunting.
There's
There
a
was
guy, there's a wonderful naturalist at the National Geographic Society named Enrique Sala. He's Basque, I think, ENRICSALA. And he's written a book called The Nature of Nature. And his specialty is oceans. So you may want to take a look at that.
Yeah, I'm jotting that down.
Enrique Sala, SALA.
There's a show on Netflix right now about I think it's called The Loneliest Whale. And have you seen it?
No.
Well, anyway, during the war, maybe right after the war, some Navy sonar guy heard a sound at 52 megahertz that didn't sound like any other whales. And then over the years, this one whale, he kept being heard, but didn't seem like he was part of a pod or anything. And so there's a little documentary on Netflix about trying to find this lonely whale. And it's a really interesting story, but the image that stuck in my mind so much from this show was the patterns of the noise that's happening in the ocean because of boats and drilling and whatever. And some of these whale sounds can go 12,000 miles.
12,000 miles?
Yeah, think about that. Does anything that we can produce except for an airplane go that far? And it's making it so that whales can't find each other and they can't teach their young. So it's not just contamination of stuff, it's also contamination of noise. And when I saw that one image, it just struck me as almost, and also they show the patterns of where the whales and all the other fish and everything go. It just struck me as undaunting. I mean, just daunting.
It is daunting. But we do have to remain undaunted.
Yes, that's what we're hoping for.
Did they ever find the one whale?
No, but they did think they found two whales with the same 52 megahertz. So maybe there's more than one whale, that there's a whole other species of whale that we haven't really pegged yet.
Wow, that would be amazing.
It's interesting, very interesting.
Now I'll have to watch it.
Yeah.
I got to write this down.
I can't remember the exact name, but it's something like if you look up whale number 52 or the loneliest whale, I'm sure it will pop up.
Okay, thanks.
Tony,
Yeah,
I spend most of my time in the ocean as a captain, and I made a connection with the boreal forest as like, I've never been to it, and I know it doesn't have roads, a lot of it, and I was really captivated by how you brought out the immenseness of it. To me, it seems like a vast ocean. It does. And one thing, the indigenous people up there, the way Trudeau kind of just told the country, look, you have control over this and we're going to give you vast parts of it. Is the reason we couldn't do it down here with a lot of lands is because it's not like one big contiguous, wild area, that it's already broken up so much? Is that why it would be hard for us to return a lot of the land to the Native Americans?
well, it's partly that, Bill, and it's partly that we voted them off so much of the land.
Yeah.
So, I mean, interestingly enough, there was a Supreme Court decision by one of the new conservative justices that said, rightfully speaking, most of eastern Oklahoma is still in Native American ownership.
Yes, indeed.
Um, That was Neil Gorsuch.
Mhm.
So a lot of it's unsettled, and we, of course, now have our very first Native American Secretary of the Interior and our very first Native American head of the National Park Service. But we've broken so many connections. We have to come up with something, our own solution down here in the States that brings the Native Americans into the picture on an equal footing, but there's a lot that's not as simple as the Canadian ability to just turn the land over to the people who were never dispossessed from it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
In Indonesia, which has 17,000 islands, not all of them are inhabited, well, I scuba dive there. And now recently, when you get to some of the islands, the little islands, the boat captain or the dive people will have to go into the little island and bring an offering, a can of gas or some fruit or something, plus money to the people that are living in that little island in order to dive on their reef. And before this, the main way they fished on these reefs was through dynamite fishing. You know, they throw TNT in there and the fish gets stunned and they float to the surface and then they scoop them up. So it doesn't do much to make the reef the kind of reef you want to go diving in. So now there's more of a symbiosis between the people that want to come there and dive and the people that need us to come there or want us to come there and give them fruit and fuel and money, so that there's some incentive for the people on that little island to not blow the dynamite up into the reef. And that seemed like a similar type thing where they were re-incentivized how to view their reef. And some of the people are learning how to dive and take people on diving trips and whatnot.
That sounds great. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to have to do that kind of thing everywhere, you know, that the populations are mixed between the people who've always been there and those of the people like us who come galumphing in later on.
Well, we could all be stakeholders, no matter how long we've had a stake in this place,
Exactly.
but we don't seem to have the right stake. We have a very short-term view.
Well, I think reality is calling upon us to start thinking at a different scale, both in terms of space and in terms of time. And the ability to do that is there. It just has been somewhat dormant because we thought we didn't have to think that way, that things were comfortable enough that everything would last. But I think that's what Shakespeare meant when he said, "Sweet are the uses of adversity." Well, the adversity is here now. We can put this way of thinking to work and take it seriously.
Tony, you talked in the book about New York City and how many thousands of acres are composed of parks and forests in the boroughs of New York City. And there's a group called the Natural Areas Conservancy.
That's right. That's
Is
sort of the first support group, friends of group, that's specifically targeted to the wildlands that are left within the 5 boroughs of New York. And even after 4 centuries of nonstop development, there are still all these woods and all these wetlands, 20,000 acres or more. So we got something that never got taken away from us, and that's a wonderful place to start. And this group is got a lot of people who are just good at what they do and also sensitive to the need to expose as many New Yorkers as possible to this amazing asset. Because of course, there's all the disparity among New York City, as among so many cities, of people who have can easily take advantage of natural areas and those who feel themselves to be cut off from it and need to be exposed to it. So they're bringing people in, they're building trail systems. They see this as the social justice component of natural areas protection. And they're making common cause with cities across the US. I forget quite exactly what the statistic that I put in the book was, but it's amazing how much natural land is within the park systems of major US cities that has never until now been recognized as a core asset of the cities.
I think during the pandemic, a lot of cities had that
Good point.
reckoning when the residents started realizing they could actually walk in these parks. I think the 20,000 acres in New York you were talking about was ironic. I didn't know that because we took a bus trip up to New York last fall from Ocean City for the privilege of walking through the little island that was built off of the coast down near the museum. What's the art museum? Little island was built out over the wharf where the ships used to come in and dock. And so we walked on that and went up and walked on the High Line. That was my
Oh, yes,
exposure-
yes, yes.
my exposure to the nature part of New York City.
Well, the High Line is a great thing.
That's another one.
Because-
A lot of towns are trying to emulate that, I think.
Right. For those of you who haven't been there, it's had started life as an overhead railroad snaking through the city to get, because originally there'd been railroad tracks on the city streets, so this was to prevent that kind of mayhem. But then they'd stopped running freight trains some years ago on this derelict overhead line, and it was rediscovered by parks people and conservationists, and now it's this extraordinary park at sort of second or third story level. You wander through the city in a way of seeing it while surrounded by native plants, a way of seeing it that you never get exposed to. You can't possibly, unless you were a drone or something and you were just floating through the skies.
Anybody else have any questions? Amy?
So this is great, and thank you for letting me be a part, even though I haven't completely read the book yet. So I'm looking forward to it, and I apologize for not coming with the more intelligent questions because this is really an honor to have you here, Tony. But I guess one thing I'm thinking about is, you know, there's a lot of different ways to go about, you know, go about increasing habitat. And some people on the call might be familiar with Doug Tallamy's you know, battle cry for each one of us to make our backyards into you know, a park, a homegrown you know, park, and you know, fill it with native plants and things to attract and protect wildlife. So that's a great thing. And then we have, you know, some, you know, positive things happening at the, you know, at the big, you know, bigger, higher up level for, you know, at the federal level or internationally, we can see some good things happening. How about the in-between area? You know, I mean, we can do what we can in, you know, the things that we feel like we have control over, whether, you know, it's our backyard, our front yard. And we can certainly, you know, be aware as voters and, you know, make choices and, you know, reach out to our lawmakers. Is there something in between the, you know, the federal and international level and our own backyard that we can, you know, think about how to impact?
which pieces of land are you thinking about? This is suburban
I
landscape?
don't know, like at the, anything. I mean, it sounds like we need to do as much as we can wherever we can.
We do, you're right. There's one environmental planner I know who, when people come to him with that question, they're usually people who love someplace. And he's always says, well, who is the Thoreau of your area? And who is the Andrew Wyeth of your area? Who has expressed the values that you're talking about? And that's a good place to start, thinking about banding together with people who have that, who've come to the same realization, and start agitating whatever it takes, whether it's for some kind of county plan or some kind of township plan or just some kind of private friends of group that can call attention to the specialness of something and how we'd be so much the worse off if we lose it. And you can talk about how it contributes to the goodness of things by being there, the well-being of things. You talked about backyards, but there's a way of uniting backyards. And the pollinator pathway movement that's so popular in cities and suburbs, that even if you plant properly street tree pits along a street, they can connect one to the other in terms of the bees knowing to go from one to the next, and the butterflies and the other insects. So there's all kinds of ways of being ingenious once you realize I can't live without whatever this is. And how do we get people to agree to that and help? It takes a village.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a a really good point that you make about, who's kind of speaking for these areas or bringing attention and helping people to appreciate them, because I think we have a lot of people in our area who do that. So I think we're in good stead there. And I think it's also really important, as your book and probably your other work makes a point of connecting people to places and making sure that they have an opportunity to appreciate them. And I think that's something that we could all do if we're people who appreciate nature, sort of find a way to to get other people to do the same.
Yes, it's partly connecting people to people, and it's partly connecting people to the landscape. So it's two different communities sort of being brought into focus.
Amy and I work on a lot of this through our different Green Team initiatives. It was interesting when I was talking to Tony before this started. He was asking about the local area and what natural resources we had here and so forth, and I reminded me to talk about the Cape May National Wildlife Refuge, which is sitting right here in the middle of Cape May County, and it's almost like one of those resources that's hidden in plain sight. The whole system of preserving this land didn't start until the late 1980s, and it's now a substantial footprint in the northern part and the central part of Cape May County. Having talks like this that we're doing tonight, I think can help at least can keep the awareness up that this sort of thing is there and it's a resource. And in our case here in Upper Township, we have what's called a natural asset inventory, natural resource inventory. It's almost like a master plan.
Great.
that Is done, and all communities have some form of that. But how that is interpreted and presented to the general public is sometimes lost in the sequence of events. And so groups like what we're doing, I think, are able to keep that more visible. And I think it's something that we can pattern elsewhere too. A lot of us sometimes feel that people take this stuff for granted. They'll go out and walk in the park, and they'll go take a bicycle ride around a trail in the state park, and don't really have any nudge to actually come and realize there has to be people who are going to be advocates and speak about this stuff. That if your state park system gradually has less and less funding every year, at a certain point, areas that you thought were always going to be there may not be open anymore. And the trail you like to walk on may not be maintained anymore. So it's something we can all work with.
I was also struck, Ralph, when I started to read up a little bit after you and I talked, what a long-term effort this also is, because Belle Plaine State Park was set up in 1923. Well, that's almost 100 years ago.
Right.
So people have been thinking about this, and it's cumulative. So we've got to keep that sense of continuity going, as well as the sense that now that we have all these different entities, they all need to be fully funded. They all need their own resources. Somehow they need to have their own endowments so that they stay real and part of what's available. And as I was saying, that's something we're just beginning to come to terms with. It is one of the challenges. It isn't enough just to say this is special and it's not protected. That's got to be a living pursuit to keep it that way.
I think here in Cape May County, it has proven to be true, because we rely our economy is based so much on tourism. And over the past few years, the different entities that market tourism have brought this whole concept of the natural resources that we have, as well as like the historical and the cultural aspect, into the marketing and the sales presentation. And so I think it's sort of like back and forth. They realize that that's important, and I think that the local entities then are going to be more prone to support these things and be stronger advocates, either at the public level and also at the municipality level as we go forward.
Well, you too can become an ecotourism destination.
Yes, it certainly, that's how we market it. That's the county does. A lot of the communities talk about ecotourism, and folks like Bill with his position and captaining his boat down there. I mean, that's the whole almost the backbone of our local economy, is how these are all interconnected. I had one question, Tony. When we talk to authors, always like to find out who are you reading now? What books are you reading on this general topic of environmental protection? Put you on the spot.
I just got a book today by a professor at SUNY Stony Brook named Carl Safina, and it's called Beyond Words. And he's very interested in how animals communicate and stay in touch with each other. And it's particularly looking at elephants and whales, killer whales. And he's been very interested in the subject. It's one thing for us to say these are wild animals, but he said most of these animals have to learn how to be wild. That's what their parents, that's what their mothers teach them, is how actually to survive in that landscape. And that's why it's so important for them to be able to have a habitat where they can grow up without being interrupted. And why it's so hard for orphaned animals to be reintroduced into the wild. No one's ever taught them how to be wild. So it's so similar to the kind of needs we had growing up. So he's a very good writer, as this the writer I was recommending to Carrie, Enric Sala. So those are a couple of the books. So I've got to confess, I also read thrillers on the side, just when I'm trying to not think about these things.
We all do. Very good. All right. Well, anybody else have any last minute topics you'd like to talk about or questions?
I'd certainly be happy to stay in touch with all of you people. I'm so happy to have met you all.
Okay.
And you are the guardians of such an important part of the planet, of such importance, both to the forests and to the birds and to the waters. So congratulations to all of you and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
you.
Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
It
This
was
has been
wonderful.
great.
Tony.
Thank you, that was great.
I
And
will,
as I said at the outset, I'm willing to blab to any group that'll listen. So think of other forums, let me know.
Wow.
And the
And
book
thank
will be
you,
out in
Ralph, for
paperback.
setting this up.
The book will be out in paperback in March, so it'll be a little cheaper too.
It was
Well-
worth it already.
oh, I missed that. So your book
see.
we're talking about will be out in March in paperback?
End of March, it's coming out as a paperback.
Then you'll make the circuit again on all the talk shows. This will
Oh,
be good.
no. I'll certainly get the word out as best I can.
Well, just to wrap up for a minute, then, we started this at the end of last year. We're trying to meet once a month now as a book group. The program is a sort of a spinoff that was started under what's now called the Upper Cape Sustainability, which is right now is constituting the 5 communities here in northern Cape May County, which will be Ocean City, Upper Township, Dennis Township, CL City, and Woodbine. And we're going to meet once a month. The next meeting will be on the 15th of February. And the books that we're going to be featuring are going to be available at our local libraries in Ocean City and also here in Upper Township, the upper branch of the Cape May County Library System. And we're going to give a heads up also to the bookstore in Ocean City, Sunrose Books, and they're going to be having our future books on sale over there as well as Tony's. So this has been great. I think we will keep you informed, and if we have anything further, why we'll be sure to send out emails to you all, and the other people that were registered but weren't on the call tonight, I'm going to email them a copy of the link for our recording. And when we go forward, we'll see if we can probably for the future establish some sort of a book channel on YouTube for these talks. So this has been very helpful. I appreciate everybody coming tonight, and I wish you all well, and we'll see you down the road.
Well, so happy to have
Thank you.
with you, Ralph, and Carrie, and Carol, and Bill, and Amy. What a great bunch.
Thank
Thank
you.
All right. Thank you all.
Ralph, do we have another book for next month already picked out?
We do. I
That's the
will
Royal
email it.
We.
I'll email it to you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.